So we're on the top of Yutes Amud Aleph. We're proceeding on. I'm going to go through the Mishnah. We said we listed a lot of different groups of places that cause damage. So this is the end of the first group. When we said different types of virus, and these are all different types of gathering things in the ground, not an irrigation ditch, and the last thing that you can't build next to another person's bar, next to his pit, is a pool that's used for washing clothing. We're only talking about the soaking pit. There were two parts of just like ours. We have only one machine that does both. But first there's the soak cycle, and then there's the agitation cycle. But they didn't have two separate. They didn't have a way to clean it out and put it in. So they would use one pit that they would use to soak it with the soap, and then afterwards they put it into a separate, I guess, of clean water, and they would agitate it in that part. So the first part is the soaking section where it was soaked with the detergent. It's only talking about the first bit. The place nidu is to move. The part where they agitated daladamas. You need more because more water splashes out of the part where they're vigorously rubbing the clothing. Tanya Namihachi, the Vrechas HaKaifsin daladamas. They have a brisa that says from the part of the kaifsin, it has to be from a pool of the launderers. It has to be daladamas. Wanantanan gimel tvachim. Our Mishnah said 3 tvachim. So why does it say over there 4 amas? So it must be there's 2 separate dinim. One is for the soaking pool is tak only 3 tvachim because that's still, it doesn't make a splash. And from the agitation pit, it's 4 amas because it spreads more water around. And others have the same exact discussion, but in a more argumentative format. Our Mishnah says that a launderer's pit is 3 tvachim, but we also have a brisa that says this 4 amas. So this is he's saying it as a teretz, like kasha. Kamen achamtzin, kamen hanajin. 3 tvachim is from the place where you soak it, and 4 amas is from the place where you agitate it. He has a brisa. He learned our Mishnah saying specifically mechamtzen, from the part where you soak the clothing. The Mishnah continued, and it said, in all these 5 different types of pits, that it's going to be usher to put it near another person's pit because it's going to do damage. We'll say there's different Rishonim, but we'll say it's because of the water that's inside of it. Unless he distances it 3 tvachim from the other pit, and he sod it besid. He puts cement around the wall. So he stops water from getting out. Now, Zok Gemara, we're at the 2 dots, about 12 lines down in Yutes Amud Aleph. Ibailu, visod besitznan, oidilma oisod besitznan. The Gemara, we have in the Mishnah, it said with the vav, visod besid. But the Gemara is contemplating maybe the correct girsa is oisod besid, meaning it's an alternative. You have 2 choices. You could either keep it 3 tvachim away. Another option is you don't have to keep it 3 tvachim away, but you could just cement it to keep the water out. Excuse me. So that's the most question. When the Mishnah said sod besid, is that on top of keeping it 3 tvachim, or is it an alternative? So Mar wants to bring right. Tnan, pshita de v'sod besid tnan. I'm sorry, pshita de v'sod besid tnan. L'chayra, it has to be that it's saying in addition. You not only are you going to have to keep it 3 tvachim away, but you also have to cement. If you want to say that it's an alternative, that you only have to cement, put a cement on. And if that's the case, you don't have to make a 3 tvachim im kain, lirvenu v'lisninu. If you look, why don't we make the entire Mishnah all one explanation? Meaning, if you go back to the Mishnah, there were two buckets of cases. There was the first case of the different types of virus, different types of indentations in the ground. We say these are all different types of openings in the ground that contain water. And we said on that, shloisha tvachim, you have to keep it 3 tvachim away, v'sad b'sid. And that's what we're questioning, that v'sad b'sid, is it oisad b'sid or v'sad b'sid? Then the Mishnah continues, marchikin is gefes, you have to keep away the olive, the leftover from olive press, v'sazevel and the manure, v'samelach and salt, v'sasid and lime, v'saslayim and the flint. These are all things that produce heat. And on that, we say oisad basid. That everyone agrees over there. It says you have two choices. You could either make it 3 tvachim, or you could put on cement. So the Gemara is saying if the first part of the Mishnah was also saying oisad basid, why do we have to make two separate buckets? First the first 5, and then the next 5. Let's say all of them. That has to be 3 tvachim oisad basid. It must be that the din of a hole in the ground is different than in a hole in the ground. You need 2 things. So in order to keep in the water, it has to be 3 tvachim plus have sid. And these other things, you have 2 choices. You could either put cement on it to keep the heat in, or you can keep it 3 tvachim away. So that l'chayr it's a raya that on the first group it says v'sad b'sid. So no, dilma mishum d'loy dami. Maybe the reason why the Mishnah separated them is because the 2 groups are doing damage differently. Hi hazeka lahai. I'm sorry. That the damage done by the first group is not the same as the damage done by the second group. Reisha hazeka de masuna. The reisha, the damage that's done, is I think masunta. The masunta, yeah, it's damage that's done through water. Seifa hazeka de havlo, and the seifa is talking about damage that's done through heat. You have the olive refuse and the flint and all these things produce havel. They produce warmth, and that's how it damages the wall of the other bar. Tashma, the Yudaimer, Sela hababi adayim. We had this before. A ground that's very soft and easily crumbles. And they each made virus close to the boundaries. We say you have to keep it 3 tvachim away, and you have to put cement on. Time to baba yadayim. And the reason over there is only because it's a especially soft earth. So therefore you need both of those things, both 3 tvachim as well as making a cement wall. Haloi baba yadayim, but if it would be regular earth, loy, you wouldn't need it. So that's mashma. In our Mishnah, when we're talking about a regular bar, not a bar that's in a regular ground, you wouldn't need. It would be alternative. It would be either 3 tvachim or isad basid. No. Who hadn't dafagav the loy b'yadayim nami sad basid? Einachanami over there. It's true that it says where it's baba yadayim, where it's very soft earth that comes apart in your hand. It says that you need both 3 tvachim and sad basid. But maybe that's the same din on regular ground. But we still had to say the din over there. Even though this din would be true that you need both, even on regular ground, we had to tell you that by Babi Yadayim, the din remains the same, and you don't have to do more. Maybe you need to do Dalet Amis by soft earth. Kamashmal, and that's why it says Babi Yadayim. This is the second group of cases that we discussed in the Mishnah, that you have to keep the olive refuse and the manure and the salt and the flint away from a bar because it damages it. 3 tvachim. We learned back in Shabbos, there are certain things that are moisef hevel, that they increase heat, and you're not allowed to be timing. You're not allowed to put food into it on Shabbos or even before Shabbos, because we're worried that if you do that, you'll come to add a charcoal to heat it up with something that's also on Shabbos. So, what types of things are considered to increase heat, and what kinds of things just contain heat? Ain't timing, you can't be timing, you can't insulate food. Loy begefes, not with olive refuse, but loy bezevel, and not with manure. Loy bemelach, and not with salt. Loy besid, and not with lime. Loy bechoil, and not with sand. Sand also increases heat, and therefore it's also to be timing food on Shabbos in all these things. Ben lach and ben yivation, whether it's wet or whether it's dry. It's the Gemara. The two lists of things that increase heat are the same, except for that our Mishnah left out the case of sand, and the Mishnah over there left out the case of flint. One is asking, why are these lists not the same? They're both talking about things that increase heat. In our Mishnah, we're talking about it because it damages another bar, and over there it's talking about Legabi, the din of Hatmana on Shabbos, but L'chaira, they should be the same list. Why are they slightly different? He said because the reason why we left out slime over there by Hatmana is because typically people will not put food inside of flint, even though flint increases heat. It's not a pleasant. It's not something that people would normally use to warm up their food, because essentially because it's not as good. It doesn't keep the heat the same way these other things do. The heat escapes from it. You're saying the reason why we left out sloyim is because it's not typical to use it. But there are other things that we mentioned, legabe atmana, like gizei tzemer, which is shearings of wool, or l'shonis shalagaman, and purple wool. These are things that are used for clothing. So you normally wouldn't wrap it around your samovar. It's not. It's wasteful. Just like you wouldn't take your strimel and put it on your samovar to keep it warm. You don't take your good clothing, your good begadim, to put around your food. And even so, those are mentioned in the context of atmana, the Tanya. Timnim begizet semer or betzipet semer. You can be timing with shearings of wool and tzipet semer and strips of wool, b'shona shalagaman, and these tongues of purple wool, or bemuchen, and with padding of wool. Because all these things are not moisef hevel. They just keep heat in, but they don't add heat. So therefore, there's no din of atmana. So if you want, you could be timing them. But you can't move them because they are muksa, because since they're intended to be used to make into cloth, so therefore it's not something that you would normally use on Shabbos, so it's muksa. It's bein hashmashos. It's not intended to be used. But in any case, you see, we're mentioning a bunch of things that you don't normally use to insulate your food. Sand is something that's normal to use. It's cheap and it's not going to get damaged. But you wouldn't take your cloth and use it for that. But even so, the Brisa mentions it. So why are we saying that the Mishnah over there, L'Gabi Hatmana, left out the flintstones, the slime? Elam Rabaya Yagadal of Reya. Abaya says that Einachanami, the same din, the din of Hatmana also includes slayim, and the din over here about keeping a bar away from another bar also includes sand, even though they weren't mentioned in the Mishnah. But you learn one from the other, just like in Legabe Hatmana we mentioned chayil, we mentioned sand, and Legabe over here, Legabe a bar, we also mentioned slayim. It's coming to tell you that the same din would apply. All the things that are said by one apply by the other. Even though over here it says slayim, and it includes chayil that's mentioned by Atmana, and the same reverse, it says over there chayil and it includes slayim. Amalei Rava said back to me, Yagal of Reya Why do we say the whole list and we just leave out one, and then we say Yagad Lavreya? Its friend should, the other one should indicate what it means over here. Why would you list five things and leave out one and say learn out one from the other? Let's just say one list of all six things, and the other one just say one, and say you learn out one from the other, all other five things from the other. Why are we listing everything except for one? You should list the minimum. If you're going to say you can learn out one from the other, don't say a whole list and just leave out one. It doesn't make sense. Rava says this is the reason why we left out over there. Over here we left out chayil, and over there we left out slayim. The like tani slayim. This is the reason why we didn't say slayim legabi atmana. Mishtom nirstaki lokal kedera, because it's going to damage the pot. People would never. It's not that they're not typically going to use rocks, but it's counterindicated. When you use these hot rocks, they're going to damage the pot. It's very sharp and it will break the pot. They used ceramic pots, I guess. So people wouldn't use it because it would damage the pot. So it never happened. So that's why it wasn't just not typical, but it was actually not used. So that's why we don't mention sloyim legabe atman. And over here, the reason why we didn't mention sand, mishum dechamimimi chaim umakriri karer, because the way sand works is if it's hot, if the sand is hot, it makes other things hot, and when it's cold, it makes other things cold. So over here, we're worried about that the sand will get hot and damage the other bar, but the other bar also gets hot. The sand gets hot from from the sun. So at that point, the other wall is also hot. So the sand is not really doing anything. But if it's around food, so you can put cold food into hot sand because the sun is shining on it, and then the sand will heat up the food. But by a bar, since it's part of the same surrounding ecosystem, it's going to be just as hot as the sand. It's not going to affect them. How could you say this? You're saying that the reason why we didn't mention chayil is because it's not damaging because it has the same temperature as the surrounding area. But Rabbi Ishia does mention sand. So Vai says he thinks it does do damage. So Gemara Hasan b'matuna. That's talking about sand that's wet. Sand that's wet can include damage because it's not because of the heat, but it causes damage because it gets the other bar wet and it will cause it to break down. So Gemara Tanidan Nami Lisni Velukma b'matuna. Why doesn't our Mishnah say chayil? You're saying that the Oishia included chayil because it's wet sand, and that's why it damages. So why did our Mishnah say also chayil? And we'll understand that it's talking about wet sand. So once we said emes hamayim, which is an example of something that irrigation ditch that holds water. So once we said that, there's no need to also include chayil. Chayil is similar enough, whether it's sand that gets wet or it's what do you call it, or irrigation ditch. It's all damaging from moisture, so we don't have to say a specific case of where it got damaged with wet chayil. That's similar enough. Are you saying once you say something that damages because it has water in it, right? This is in the second group of things that are all damaging from moisture. So why do we have to say two examples of things that hold water in it? We said both irrigation ditch, and we said also a pit that's used for washing clothing. So we're saying that we didn't say chayil because it's included in nevrechas. It's included in emes hamayim. So then why isn't the nevrechas hakarsin also included in emes hamayim? So I don't know. Hani trich. We had to say both of those two cases. Ditana emes hamayim. If we would have said the irrigation dish mishum dekviyah, because an irrigation dish runs all the time. It's always being used. Aval nevrechas hakarsin the loy kviyah. The nevrechas hakarsin, which is not always used, maybe it would be it would not damage. The itana nevrechas hakarsin. We would have said the launderer's, the cleaner's pit, mishum de kavavakaini, because the water in a cleaner's pit just stays there. It's not always used, but it has stagnant water, and stagnant water is more damaging. Aval emes hamayim, but an irrigation ditch that has constantly running water, the water doesn't have a chance to seep in as much. Ema loy, maybe that would not do damage to a bar. So therefore, we needed to say both emes hamayim and the vrechas hakaysim. But chayil, we taka don't have to say according to Rava because that would be included between the two of them. Doesn't have any additional chiddush. The Mishnah said, "Machikin," it says royim v'samachrisha. We keep away seeds and the plow. Why do we have to say separately that you can't plant your seeds and you can't plow within 3 tvachim of a bar? Whenever you plant, you also have to plow. You first plow the earth, and that opens up the earth, and then you put the seeds in. So you have plowing anyway. So what do you have to tell you separately? You can't plant. So we're talking about sometimes they would plant seeds by hand without plowing. Machrisha v'tepikle mishum zrayim. Now the Gemara asks the other way around. If you're saying the reason that you're not allowed to do zrayim, because as we're going to see, because it causes roots to come out and it will cause damage to the wall. So what do you have to say machrisha for? The reason why you do machrisha is for the zrayim. So you're going to cause the damage to the zrayim anyway. So we're not talking about plowing to plant, but we're talking about the plowing that we talked about before. We said when a person plants a tree next to the border, he needs to keep an additional 4 amas so that he could plow under the tree. They used to plow under the tree to take away the weeds. So it's talking about that plowing, not the plowing that you do for wheat, but the plowing that you do under a tree, which doesn't plant anything. There's no planting associated with it. Let's say it's going to be, what do you have to say zrayim? When you do zera, you're going to have to water it. When you plant something, you have to water it. So then the water, like we saw before, we had all the cases in the Mishnah of anything that brings water close to a bar is damaging. So let the watering of the plants cause the problem. We're talking about in Eretz Yisrael, the sivla matar hashamayim tishnei mayim, that the water, the rain from the shamayim will suffice to provide moisture for a plant. So in Eretz Yisrael, you don't need irrigation, you don't need additional watering. A wall is intended to survive rain. So you can't make the guy who's planting responsible for the rain that comes and falls on the wall. So he's not adding any additional water. So therefore, we have to say zrayim itself is also because it's going to cause undermining the bar because of its own problems, not because of the mayim and not because of the machrisha. Dr. Mara lememra d'zrayim. Let's start in kamisharshi, mistarshi. So we're saying that zrayim itself, planting seeds, is problematic because it's going to send out roots that are going to undermine the wall. But Tanan, hamavrich es a gefen ba'aretz. Someone who he has a vine. So the din is a vine. We're talking over there about Klein. So a person took his vine, the end of his grapevine, and he stuck it into the ground. Im ein al gaba offer shloisha tfachim. If on top of the part that's under the ground of this vine that was stuck into the ground, it went all the way down, and then it went crosswise. If there's not 3 tvachim on top of it, lo yavi zera Allah. You can't plant zera on top of it. Even though we've learned before that you can't have a vineyard mixed in with a wheat field. That's talking about where you have an actual vineyard I think we've said it a couple of times, where you have a square with 1 extra vine. You have to have a minimum of five vines to make a vineyard. But a single vine, there's no din that you can't have wheat next to it. It just can't be together. So we're saying, as long as if there's not 3, you can't plant the zera directly above this vine that's been placed on the ground. The Tani Allah, Aval Zoyre is at Stadin, Elich Ve'elich. But you can plant wheat as long as it's not directly above this vine that was placed on the ground. If it's set off to the side at all, it's mutter. So Weistais, the Zera, the wheat does not go sideways, it just goes straight down, because we're saying as long as it's offset from being directly on top of this vine that was placed on the ground, it's mutter. So you see that Zroim don't go sideways. So Gemara says no. The problem is not that the zera goes sideways. It only goes straight down. But because it goes straight down, while it goes straight down, it's sort of like softening all the earth. The roots are softening everything. That undermines everything around it. It causes, like, let's say, like a cavity in the ground, and then everything around will collapse into that cavity that the roots are making. So this will cause the earth to move around to the sides as well, and that's why it will affect the bar, even though the roots go directly down. A person is allowed to do his tzrachim, essentially to urinate on the side of his friend's kaisel. And I'm going to cut off from Achav. This is Rebbe Shalom's promisement of Achav, Mashtin Bekir. Those who excuse the language, who urinate on the wall, which is another way of saying men. Right? This is not something that women do. This is something that men do. Va'atzur, whatever he's collected, and whatever he saved, and whatever their flocks are, all that, whatever they have left, be Yisrael. The Rebbe Shalom is promising Achav that he's going to punish him, and he says he's going to punish the men, and we describe it as mashtin bekir, those who are mashtin, they do their tzrachim on a wall. Now, if this was something that a person is not allowed to do because it damages the wall, how can we describe men as doing something that they're not allowed to do? If it's not something that's usher, they have to pay for it, we wouldn't describe them that way. Because they have to keep 3 tvachim away. So why would you say on top of a kaisel? So no. Hasam b'shayfchen. When we say, when the Mishnah says that it's usher to it doesn't mean for a person, a single individual, but it means when he empties out the waste onto the wall. He can't empty out his bucket of waste on a wall because that will undermine it. So this next part in the parentheses doesn't make sense unless you change the lashon a little. Tashma leyital adam mayim betzad kaisel shechaver and ken hirchak mimenu gimel tvachim. We see you have to keep it gimel tvachim away. We just said that you're allowed to unless you pour onto it from your pot. So Gemara Hasam Nami b'Shayfkin. Over there also it's talking about where he's pouring it. The lashon we have doesn't make any sense. It says la yishpach. So what was the hava meaning to ask a question? Gemara continues. Toshma la yashin adam mayim betzad kosher shechaveira elkem hichim menu gimel tvachim. We said a person shouldn't urinate on the side of a kaisel unless he's 3 tvachim away. That's only on a kaisel made of bricks. But a kaisel made out of stone. As long as he doesn't damage it directly by undermining it with the liquid. The kama tefach. It just has to be a tefach. And if it has, like we had this before, a foundation, a rock underneath the wall, so that there's no undermining it with moisture at all, mutter, then it's mutter even within a tefach. But in any case, we see that a person is usher to be mashin even individually within 3 tefachim. You can't say over here it's talking about shayftin. So tomorrow tiyufta the Rabbi Bachana tiyufta. In fact, the Rabbi Bachana krok amar. He brought this pasuk, which we said by Achav, where we showed that a person is allowed. We see that men are called what do we call them? Mashtin bakir. So afilu midi de darkel ishtuni bakir leishav kinole. The Rebbe was not talking about men. He's saying even something that it's normal for them to go and relieve themselves on a wall, that's I'm not going to leave even that for you. Or my new kalba, that's talking about a dog. It's not talking about people. And dogs, obviously, there's no controlling what they do. So therefore, there's no issue of them. It's not a proof that one is allowed to be mashtin on a wall. Okay, so now we're gonna start. We're gonna have a little bit of going into the dinim of a oil, of a mafsik in oil. So the din is obviously I'm a kayan. I'm not allowed to go into a hospital where we know that there's a dead person because there could be doors open between wherever the dead person is. Now, listen, might we go in because we don't know that there's a dead person. When I was in Eretz Yisrael, by Shari Tzedek, they used to have a sign up and they'd make announcements when the Kohanim had to leave. So I was there with my daughter once for a few weeks. We were constantly getting kicked out. But the reason why a hospital is a problem is because there's open doors. There could be open doors between one and the other. But if you have a mace in one room that there's no opening into a different room, it's not metama ba'oil. You have to be in the same room without anything being chaytzitz between them. But what if in between those two rooms there's an opening, and that opening is stuffed up with something that could be moved? That's going to be the discussion that we're going to talk about. Amr of Tugrak Hisna, Amr Shmuel. Rokik einem emayit bechaloin. The din is that if you have an opening in between the two rooms, that's at least a tefach by a tefach, it lets the tumah through. But what if that chaloin, that opening, has a rakik? It has like a cracker, a small piece of food that reduces the size of the opening to less than a tefach by tefach, so it doesn't let tumah in. The mission, the Brisa says, I think, yeah, the Brisa says, rakik einamai, or this is actually, Amira says, this wafer does not reduce the size of that opening to less than a tefach. Why do we have to say? Why do we have to say a rokik, a wafer, even if it's something thicker, even if it's a cookie as opposed to a wafer? Nami, it should also not reduce the size, because what's the problem with the rokik? Because it's something that someone could take and eat it. It's not something that's necessarily left there. So something thicker also should have the same din. So tomorrow, loimi boy kamer, loimi boy ava kiven the ipsile lemevatale. The not just a wafer, which it's going to be something. I'm sorry, it's the other way. A cookie, not just a cookie, a thicker thing, that it's still going to remain good. Even so, therefore, certainly a person doesn't leave it there. They're going to eventually take it and eat it. Avarokik, but a thin cracker, the mimis. Since it's a inherently wet situation, they had stone walls, and you put a thin wafer on it, it's likely to get wet and moldy. Ema betuli mevatale. Since it's likely to get moldy, maybe once you put the wafer there, you're never going to move it because it's not going to be edible. Kamash Malone, that no, there's still always that guy who's going to see a cracker. He's not going to care whether it's moldy or not. He's going to eat it anyway. Let's say it's a davar shemakabel tuma. That means any food which is made with, there are 7 types of mashkin, of waters that make something able to be makabel tuma. So if this thing that you're putting in the window is something that could be makabel tuma, it doesn't stop the tuma from coming through at all. It doesn't separate mea tuma. And for Dugmar Paris, we're talking about, like, the mezainis pizza that you make it, the rolls that you make it with mei Paris, with fruit juice. So fruit juice is not one of the things that makes something able to be makabel tuma. In addition to making it mezainis, it also makes it that it's not makabel tuma. So this wafer was made with that, and therefore it's not makabel tuma. Meisve kupa malaya tevin, va'bayis v'chavis malaya goyres. If you have a box full of grain, or a barrel full of dried figs. These things were placed in that one tefach opening. You have to look at it. If you were to remove the container, now a container is a kli. A kli is makabel tuma. So the kli itself is not going to be chaytzitz. But the contents of the kli are things that are not makabel tuma. We're talking about things that were not touched by water. So they never became this teven or this gregris themselves are not makabel tuma. So they could be chaytzitz. So you have to look at it if you were to remove the thing holding the container, which itself is makabel tuma. If you would take that away and the contents would still remain in that opening, that they would stay there, then they could be chaytzitz and stop. But if not, they're not chaytzitz. But why are we saying that this should be able to be chaytzitz m'nei atuma? But the reason why these things are chaytzitz is only because it's something that's going to be left there. But these things l'chayra have a use, and therefore they are going to be taken away because teven, the grain, is good could be used to feed his animals. Zaktu Yamara, Besarya. We're talking about rotten teven, which you don't feed to your animals. But still chazi latina, you could still use it for your cement. This beikaitzi, we're talking about it has thorns. When it has thorns, people don't use it in cement because the way they made the cement was they would add some straw, some grain to it, and they would jump on it. And if it had thorns, that would not end well. But still, someone will take it out. It shouldn't be chaytzitz because people use it for their fires. But matuna, we're talking about where it's moist hay that's not useful for a fire because it's too moist. It's not going to catch fire. Chazil has a gadol, but you could still use it for a bonfire because a bonfire doesn't make difference if it's wet; it will dry it out. Has a gadol ishchiach, not so typical. Okay. Why? So we dealt with the straw. Why? I'm sorry. I translated it as grain, but it's really straw because grain you would eat. You would use it for flour. So we're talking about straw. But what about the other example, the dried figs? Dried figs are you could eat them. So why do we say that it's chaytzitz? Why when we chaysh that someone's going to take them away? Amoshmul b'shetrifu. We're talking about that they're already spoiled. Well, he also explains that it's talking about where they're already spoiled, they already have worms in them, and therefore they're not able to be eaten. And therefore, when a person puts them there, he's going to leave them there, and therefore it's chaytzitz. Okay, we'll stop over here. Let's jump to 7 o'clock tomorrow.
Yes,